Hi everyone, this is our fifth and final lecture for part 1 of the Neuroscience and Relationship class. I am Dr. Julie Mefesovic, and today I will talk about spirituality in the brain. Perhaps, since you have chosen Sophia University or ITP as your graduate school, I can assume I'm talking to students who fall in the spiritual or questioning camp. Certainly at Sophia University we have a particular appreciation for and expertise in the realm of psychology and spirituality. And thankfully, there is now a growing body of literature about spirituality and neuroscience. This is a difficult subject to cover in a short period of time. So my hope today is simply to spark your interest, give you some leads to follow up on, and inspire you to be the next generation of neurologically mindful transpersonal therapists. My objectives for this lecture are the following. First, I'll set the stage by acknowledging the debate between materialists and transpersonalists, and define what I mean when I am using the terms spiritual, transpersonal psychology, and transcendence. Then I'll talk about altered states of consciousness and the use of psychedelic substances to induce spiritual experiences, and how that may be therapeutic or provide insight into our knowledge of spirituality and the brain. We will also look at what pharmacological action is happening in the brain when psychedelic substances are at work. Then, we will look at near-death experiences and one more recent theory about what might be going on in the brain to explain the subjective experience of near-death experience. Then we will touch upon meditation, prayer, and mystical experiences and some of the research and the mechanisms going on in the brain. Finally, I'll address some clinical implications and how we can use this information in a therapy session. One could consider the history of spirituality in the brain to be long when including indigenous cultures and their use of brain-altering substances for spiritual purposes, or it can be thought of as a very short history, because traditionally, just like neurologists have tended to avoid addressing the spiritual realm, transpersonal psychologists have tended to avoid the neurological realm. While there has been plenty of interest in altered states of consciousness, there has been, unfortunately, relatively little focus on the actual mechanisms in the brain associated with spiritual states of consciousness. This may be because identifying parts of our brains that produce spiritual experiences feels reductionistic, and transpersonal psychologists have had enough to contend with in regard to establishing our field as a science. And feeding fuel to the fire of materialism would have been contrary to the goal. However, growing interest in this realm from a variety of sources is resulting in a steadily increasing foundation of research on prayer in the brain, meditation in the brain, near-death experiences, and how mystical experiences show up on brain imaging scans. Theories abound in neuroscience explaining away spirituality as the God part of the brain, the God gene, the God spot, or God molecule. Materialist theories have suggested that human spirituality is a genetically inherited trait because supposedly cave dwellers who got religion were more likely to survive than those who didn't. Or it has been suggested that spirituality is just an evolutionary instinct. Or there is the theory that the mind is a delusion of the brain. There was even a God helmet created to stimulate the areas of the brain thought to create spiritual experiences in an effort to pinpoint spirituality in the brain and then prove it could be recreated. I will not discuss these theories here, only to say that just like the fact that many humans have reported spiritual experiences does not prove that a higher power exists, so a God spot in our brain that identifies where the brain is active when these experiences occur does not prove that there is no higher power. Perhaps one day we will finally come to the conclusion, just like most of us did with the nature-nurture discussion, that it is not an either-or conversation, but rather a both-and. I encourage you to read Beauregard and O'Leary's 2007 book, The Spiritual Brain, for a review of these theories and why the authors believe they do not successfully minimize spiritual experiences to a neurobiological factor. So as is fitting to the topic, we abide by faith, and we do the best we can to sort through the theories and the research, and we look at our subjective experiences and that of others, and continue to question the truth with an open mind, if such a thing as the mind exists, and an open heart. Interestingly, the first chapter of William James's The Varieties of Religious Experiences is entitled Religion and Neurology. In this introductory chapter, James addresses medical materialism, and while he acknowledges the organic origins of states of mind, he too asserts that to assume this explains away religious experiences is, quote, illogical and arbitrary. In The Spiritual Brain, Beauregard and O'Leary put it nicely when they wrote, "An open-minded neuroscience can significantly contribute to a model of mind that is not a delusion, and tell us some important facts about spiritual, mystical experiences." Before we go any further, I think we need to define some terms. I'll start with spirituality. For brevity's sake, I'll steal the words of the author of a book I read in preparation for this lecture entitled The Spiritual Doorway to the Brain. The author is a neurologist named Kevin Nelson, MD, who, according to the book, is a recognized authority on the neurological processes of spiritual sensation in Lexington, Kentucky. Nelson wrote, "The term spiritual is generally applied to any human essence connecting us to an unseen world that defies scientific measurement, but which we nonetheless believe and feel exists, leaving traces here and there. It can refer to anything transcendent or something that deeply moves or transports us and connects us in one way or another to something larger than ourselves." Even in Nelson's description of spirituality, we begin to see one of the biggest challenges. If spirituality is not measurable, how do we relate it to science? How do we speak in a language that will be heard by scientists and the greater community of critics? Enter transpersonal psychology. The definition of transpersonal psychology that I am using comes from LaHoy and Shapiro's 1992 definition, which states, "Transpersonal psychology is concerned with the study of humanity's highest potential and with the recognition, understanding, and realization of unitive, spiritual, and transcendent states of consciousness." One thing most people cannot argue is that humans are having experiences they consider to be spiritual, and these experiences often have profound meaning for the person, and leave after effects of personal transformation, or in the very least, leave questions that are a catalyst for change and growth. Transpersonal psychology acknowledges, values, and emphasizes these experiences and their import for psychological well-being. Finally, I'll throw in a definition of transcendence from prominent existential humanistic psychologist James BUGENTAL. A core meaning of the term transcendence is going beyond. Going beyond, in particular, the dichotomies which we unthinkingly accept as the givens of our lives: good, bad, right, wrong, real, unreal, I, other, health, illness, growth, decline, life, death, God, human. It is not that we discard these comparisons, but that they are seen in a more inclusive perspective. Now, as we know, science and neurology have never been particularly good at moving beyond dichotomies, and so spirituality and science have never been an easy combination. And so I wondered about what would be considered spirituality in practice that we could look at in relationship to the brain. So I went back to my textbook. And when I searched the textbook of Transpersonal Psychiatry and Psychology, published in 1996, for mention of the brain, I found that even back then there was mention of meditation's effects on the brain, psychedelic drugs and transpersonal psychology, and a brief mention of the hope of one author for a proposed neuroanatomical model of near-death experiences. Also, there was a chapter on psychopharmacology and transpersonal psychology. So we will look a little at each of these topics. Also, I referred back to one of my first transpersonal teachers, Charlie TART, because often when we are talking about spiritual experiences, we are talking about altered states of consciousness. For example, states of prayer or meditation, the dance of the Sufi whirling dervishes, states of ecstasy or transformation reported by those who experience a so-called peak experience or near-death experience, or spiritual emergencies. Transpersonal psychologist Charles TART made an interesting point in his introduction to the text Altered States of Consciousness. He points out that, quote, "Within Western culture, we have strong negative attitudes toward altered states of consciousness. There is the normal, good state of consciousness, and there are pathological changes in consciousness." End quote. He gives schizophrenia as an example. It is true that we spend a great deal of time exploring the brain states of what are considered pathological states of consciousness, obviously with the good intentions of treating dysfunction and improving quality of life in those suffering. However, we focus less on brain states of what might be considered positive states of consciousness. It is almost as if these positive states of consciousness are somehow taboo or not good scientific material. A sort of cultural shadow no one wants to look at, but that millions of people are seeking through mind-altering substances, extreme sports, meditation, video games, and other types of virtual realities of all shapes and sizes. I think this is the bias that transpersonal psychology has struggled with all along. Charlie Tart's book, published first in 1969, is dedicated to exploring the positive states of consciousness that, as he says, many people will go to considerable trouble and effort to induce. Tart's book explores hypnagogic states, dreams, meditation, hypnosis, psychedelic drugs, and yoga. Part of the problem is obviously that transpersonal experiences can be very difficult to empirically study. Spiritual experiences generally happen to people not when they are hooked up to EEGs or lying in an fMRI scanner with the specific purpose of collecting data. Spiritual experiences happen in the intimate moments of everyday lives. So we are severely limited to studying subjective experiences, which have historically not been particularly valued in the scientific world, or to those areas that we can study in a lab and or that we are allowed to study because much of the research on psychedelic substances have been banned. San Francisco psychiatrist Bruce S. Victor wrote a chapter in the transpersonal textbook entitled Psychopharmacology and Transpersonal Psychology, in which he wrote, "Psychopharmacology and transpersonal psychology are commonly perceived as antithetical to one another, a fact that reflects a culture-wide mind-body split. The only area in which these two fields have found common ground has been in clinical and research work with psychedelic drugs. Unfortunately, governmental sanctions have all but stopped the use of psychedelics in the clinical context and as tools to investigate the physiology and cartography of the human psyche. Historically, the biological and the spiritual were not considered separate, particularly in the realm of healing. Many traditional societies frequently employed psychotropic substances not only as medicinal products, but also as a necessary part of the pre-shamanic curriculum to assist the healer in expanding his psychological and spiritual healing powers. These substances were also employed by the non-shamanic members of traditional societies for worship and problem solving, for example, the peyote ritual among some Native American tribes. Victor identifies 4 factors that have contributed to the separation of the biological from the spiritual. First, Victor points out that this separation of biology and spirituality is an extension of the traditionally Western religious distinction between body and soul, or body and spirit. Next, he points to the fact that psychoanalytic psychology was based on a dualistic conceptualization of mind and body. He used Carl Jung as an example, stating that, quote, "Although the theories of Carl Jung are often seen as forming a conceptual bridge from the psychoanalytic to the transpersonal, they did little to include neurochemistry or neurophysiology as mediators of mental change." In fact, Jungian analysts often appear to subtly denigrate the biological and physiological factors, as though they are lower and less significant matters than the archetypal and transcendent reality. When I personally was attending ITP, specializing in somatic psychology, this was very much my experience. Somehow the spiritual outweighed the physical or neurological in importance. A third factor contributing to the divorce of the biological from the transpersonal or spiritual, according to Victor, is that early biological interventions for psychological dysfunction such as insulin therapy or electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, were not exactly focused on spiritual development. In fact, many have drastic side effects and were not palatable to those avowed to a transpersonal perspective. Lastly, Victor suggested that a trivialization of the biological in Western culture has contributed to the breach between the biological and the spiritual. He wrote, quote, Traditional societies had clear and established rules regarding the use of mind-altering substances. There were specifications regarding who among the population were permitted to use them, when they could be used, what specific substances might be used, and why they were to be used on certain occasions." End quote. As an aside, I might add to this description behaviors that induce altered states of consciousness. In the past and in other cultures, rituals were performed with a purpose and with spiritual guidance, not the haphazard, unguided experimentation that we witness in today's world. Victor went on to say, quote, "In contrast to these societies, Western cultures in the 20th century emphasized the notion of recreational drug use. Faculty at prominent universities in this country indiscriminately handed out psychedelic drugs to their students, oblivious to the necessity of considering both setting, the environmental context of the proposed ingestion, and set, broadly, the internal preparation of the user in their use. Because of this casual treatment of what might be considered sacramental substances, psychotropic chemicals came to be feared for their consequences and denigrated concerning their transpersonal significance." End quote. So why are we talking so much about psychedelic substances? Because substances known to affect the brain are also known to induce mystical or spiritual experiences. Therefore, we know the brain plays a role. So let's take a closer look at so-called psychedelic therapy. There is much to be said about the use of psychedelic plants for healing purposes, and a great deal of research has been and is being done about the psychotherapeutic benefits of psychedelic plants. But for today's lecture, I will focus on the significance of psychedelic substances as they relate to the brain and spirituality. Psychedelic is a descriptive term commonly used to refer to a set of psychoactive drugs that act on various neurotransmitters in the central nervous system to produce powerful psychological experiences, such as visual hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, and significant changes in cortical functioning, including cognition, perception, and mood. We can classify psychedelic drugs by their neurochemical action, giving us some insight into what is going on in the brain associated with the sometimes considered spiritual effects. Anticholinergic drugs, such as scopolamine, act as acetylcholine receptor blockers. While it is occasionally used recreationally for its hallucinogenic properties, the experiences are often extremely mentally and physically unpleasant, and frequently physically dangerous, so repeated use is rare. Catecholamine-like psychedelics, such as peyote and ecstasy, are those structurally similar to both catecholamine neurotransmitters, noradrenaline and dopamine, and the amphetamines, which would include methamphetamine. Presumably, these substances exert psychostimulant actions on dopaminergic neurons, enhancing energy, endurance, sociability, and sexual arousal. However, their psychedelic actions are probably ultimately exerted on augmentation of serotonin transmission by acting as agonists at postsynaptic serotonin receptors. These substances are classified as mixed dopamine and serotonin agonists. Some are found in nature and others are synthetically manufactured. Serotonin-like psychedelic drugs, like LSD and psilocybin in so-called magic mushrooms, work like agonists at serotonin receptors. Glutaminergic NMDA receptor antagonists, such as PCP and ketamine, were first developed as use as amnestic or analgesic drugs. They are thought to work by inhibiting NMDA receptors. And finally, salvinorin A, aka salvia, is an herb in the mint family that has been used for curing and for divination in traditional spiritual practices by the Mazatec peoples of Oaxaca, Mexico for many centuries. Salvia is an agonist on kappa opioid receptors. In a case report, Haynes, in 2001, wrote about a patient with severe depression, unrelieved by traditional antidepressant medications, who obtained salvia. She chewed 2 or 3 leaves at a time, 3 times per week, and claimed total remission of depressive symptoms. Continued use was accompanied by continued effectiveness, quote, engendering a kind of psycho-spiritual awakening characterized by the discovery of her sense of self, greater self-confidence, increased feelings of intuitive wisdom and connectedness to nature, end quote. However, as a kappa agonist, the drug also has potential to induce rather than relieve depressive symptoms. Salvia has become very popular among teenagers in recent years because it is legal and can be purchased at health food stores. But the effects can be extreme and dangerous. I encourage you to educate yourself about this substance, especially if you work with teenagers and/or parents of children. Again, in the Transpersonal textbook, Bravo and Grob, 1996, introduced the so-called psychedelic paradigm for the use of psychedelics in clinical psychiatric research and psychotherapy. The author stated that, quote, when higher doses of psychedelic drugs were given, patients began to describe spiritual and mystical experiences that did not fit the personal psychology framework of psychoanalysis, but appeared to have therapeutic effects, end quote. As a result, a new technique of psychedelic therapy evolved that has as its goal the production of an ego-dissolving mystical experience. Practitioners claimed success treating chronic alcoholism, antisocial behaviors, and autism, as well as alleviating the pain and anguish of terminal illnesses. Most of this clinical work was banned by the mid-60s. However, some continued the work. For example, Stanislav Grof continued to work with psychedelics well into the 70s. Grof developed a comprehensive theory of LSD therapy. He believed that LSD, when used with a therapeutic focus, allowed people to work through deep traumatic fixations in their psyche. Those familiar with Grof's work know he also used breathing techniques to obtain therapeutic altered states of consciousness in a method called holotropic breathwork. And Salvador Roque, inspired by Mexican healing rituals using psychedelic mushrooms, devised a group therapy technique using high doses of a variety of psychedelics, sensory overload, and somatic exercises to weaken psychological defenses and promote ego-shattering experiences. And in the 80s, psychotherapists found that the drug MDMA, or ecstasy, had a powerful effect to facilitate the relaxation of defense mechanisms, enhanced access to emotions, and a feeling of safety, without the perceptual and cognitive distortions that were often so concerning about psychedelics. As an example, MDMA has been used in couples therapy. Still today, an organization called MAPS, or Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, continues to research the therapeutic effects of psychedelic substances. According to their website, quote, founded in 1986, MAPS is a nonprofit research and educational organization that develops medical, legal, and cultural contexts for people to benefit from the careful use of psychedelics and marijuana. According to Bravo and Grob, however, most theorists of psychedelic psychotherapy, quote, agreed that the drugs were not in the healing agents, rather they are adjuncts to the psychotherapeutic process, and their therapeutic value is determined by the structure of the therapy and the quality of the therapist, end quote. In-depth research of psychedelic drugs is extremely challenging because of the legal ramifications of acquiring and using these drugs. But popular culture shows us that there is an incredible drive to experiment with mind-altering substances. So the question arises, what is it about altering our brain chemistry that is so appealing and/or therapeutic? I can't answer this question, but I agree with theorists such as Andrew WEIL, MD, who suggested that the lack of experiences that induce altered states of consciousness, such as ritual or rites of passage, in modern society, have resulted in youth reaching for other forms of altered states of consciousness. Dr. WEIL, who has become something of a guru in the world of holistic health and medicine, has always been open about his use of experimental and recreational drugs. The premise of WEIL's book, The Natural Mind, is that the desire to alter consciousness periodically is innate and normal, and if humans do not find a way to meet this need in a healthy form of ritual, they will seek out means to meet this end. WEIL is a prolific writer, including a book authored with Winifred Rosen in 1983 entitled From Chocolate to Morphine, Everything You Need to Know About Mind-Altering Drugs. Similar to the study of psychedelics, near-death experiences have a relatively broad research base. We look at them here because of the potential insight this profound experience offers to our knowledge of the brain in relationship to spirituality. In the textbook of Transpersonal Psychiatry and Psychology, Bruce Grayson addressed the near-death experience as a transpersonal crisis. Grayson stated, "When people come close to death, they may go through a profound experience in which they appear to leave their body and enter some other realm or dimension, transcending the boundaries of the ego and the ordinary confines of time and space." Grayson refers to Raymond Moody, the psychiatrist who named the phenomenon and who wrote extensively based on interviewing many individuals who had experienced NDE. Moody defined NDE as an ineffable experience that may include feelings of peace, unusual noises, being out of the physical body, movement through a dark tunnel, meeting other spiritual beings, a life review, a border or point of no return, a return to the physical body, and profound changes in attitudes and values. Grayson wrote at that time that several neurochemical models for NDE had been proposed, but at that point they were untestable. However, he felt they offered hope that scientists may someday bridge the gap between mystical experience and physiological events. Well, many studies have been done since that time, and reports of near-death experiences continue to come in. Errors in reporting in the past have led to a common misunderstanding that NDE happens to people who are clinically dead. And since survivors report having spiritual experiences and then live to tell the story, this seems to prove that consciousness transcends the brain or body. However, it turns out it is not as simple as that. First of all, the brain is not dead during a near-death experience. The heart may have stopped beating, hence the quintessential flat line of an electrocardiogram. But brain death, from which there is no recovering, occurs when the brain cells die. According to neurologist Kevin Nelson in his book about near-death experiences, quote, "After blood flow to the brain stops, the brain goes along quite nicely for 10 seconds or so. It is not dead. Only after that 10-second point does the brain begin to malfunction, but it still doesn't approach death for several minutes, even when it has zero blood flow." End quote. According to Nelson, researchers have found no underlying conditions that trigger NDE. No particular medication, chemical imbalance in the blood, or resuscitation pattern. Nor do these experiences seem to be linked to the length of time it took to revive a patient or how long he or she was unconscious, which would reflect how long the brain was deprived of blood and oxygen. So what might be going on in the brain that contributes to near-death experience? One theory has been that perhaps endorphins are released during medical crisis and cause these experiences, explaining the euphoric mood. But this does not explain the out-of-body experiences, the brilliant light, or other aspects of near-death experiences. Another theory involves the neurochemical system of NMDA, a chemical used by nerves to communicate with one another, which excites the brain. The effects of the drug ketamine, sometimes used in anesthesia and acting through the NMDA system, mimic some features of the NDE, including hallucinations and, on rare occasions, out-of-body experiences. And apparently, astronomer Carl Sagan theorized that the NDE may be a patient experiencing memories of their birth. Nelson was not a fan of that theory, because according to him, reliving a birth experience that occurred before the brain was physically capable of forming the synapses necessary for memory is, quote, woefully unscientific, end quote. Nelson wrote that in a poll of nearly 2,000 people interested in near-death experiences, 45% said they believed they were encounters with a, quote, non-earthly, end quote, spiritual world. 20% attributed the experiences to body and brain function, and the rest felt that the cause remained elusive, or they registered no clear opinion. Kevin Nelson's own personal theory of the near-death experience is that NDEs happen when individuals are in a brain state that is at once conscious, but also in an REM sleep state. He gives numerous examples of people who have become conscious during a serious medical crisis, and although paralyzed, were able to later report what was going on in the room, but in the moment, unable to move or communicate in any way with the doctors to let them know of their conscious awareness. These states, often paired with the traditional near-death experience phenomenon of going into a tunnel, bright lights, etc., according to Nelson, may be explained as follows. With death approaching, what if we were overtaken by REM paralysis, our visual system stimulated to produce light, and the dreaming apparatus in our brains triggered, all while we were consciously awake and in a state of medical crisis? Nelson conducted research to test his hypothesis. He claims to have collected one of the largest numbers of research participants with near-death experiences ever compiled and compared their sleep experiences to the experiences of other people matched by gender and age. Nelson found that at some point in their lives, those people who have had a near-death experience were also very likely to have experienced some aspect of REM sleep intruding in their everyday waking world. During the transition between being awake and being asleep, many of the research participants found that they became momentarily paralyzed or had visual or auditory hallucinations. This means that the brain mechanism that flip-flops between REM and wakefulness was different in people who have a near-death experience. Instead of passing directly between REM sleep and wakefulness, their brains were more likely to fragment and blend those states of consciousness. Nelson is not, according to his book, trying to merely explain away the experiences by locating them in the brain. Rather, he is trying to make the point that, quote, our spiritual experiences have instinctual qualities, originating in the most primitive parts of the brain, end quote. He proposes that the spiritual doorway in the brain is primal and connected at its root to the origin of life. In his epilogue, Nelson wrote, basing one's spirituality on science is as foolhardy as basing one's science on spirituality. No matter if we could know how every single brain molecule makes spiritual experience, why the brain is spiritual will remain for many of us our most treasured mystery. There is room in the brain for faith. Another area that has managed to accumulate a bit of research is regarding both prayer and meditation. In the early 2000s, Andrew NEWBERG at the University of Pennsylvania did some preliminary research with meditation and prayer using SPECT scans, or single photon emission computed tomography, which maps blood flow and metabolism after the injection of radioactive substances. Part of his research involved scanning Franciscan nuns while they performed centering prayer to open themselves up to the presence of God. Subjectively, they were reporting a, quote, loss of the usual sense of space, end quote. As a result of their studies, NEWBERG and Dakili concluded, at the heart of our theory is a neurological model that provides a link between mystical experience and observable brain function. In simplest terms, the brain seems to have the built-in ability to transcend the perception of an individual self. We have theorized that this talent for self-transcendence lies at the root of the religious urge. NEWBERG's findings are reported in his 2001 book, Why God Won't Go Away, as well as several published studies. Follow-up research by Beauregard and Paquet in 2006 was designed to study the mystical union of Carmelite nuns. Mystical union was defined by Beauregard as a state in which one feels completely united with God, this being the ultimate goal of the contemplative Christian mystic. The first part of the study involved using fMRI scans on nuns as they recalled and then relived their most significant mystical experiences, as well as their most intense state of union with another human. They also scanned the nuns during a baseline condition, a normal, restful state, and had a control group. The second part of the study involved recording brain waves with the QEEG, or quantitative electroencephalography, which measures electrical patterns at the surface of the scalp that reflect brainwave patterns. Finally, the researchers asked the nuns to describe their subjective experiences so they could compare them to the scans. Conclusions from the research were that many brain regions, not just the temporal lobes, as was suggested with regard to the God spot theories, are involved in mystical experiences. Areas highlighted by the SPECT scans were the inferior parietal lobule, the visual cortex, the caudate nucleus, and the left brainstem, among others. Beauregard concluded that The results of our fMRI and QEEG studies suggest that religious, spiritual, and/or mystical experiences are neurally instantiated by different brain regions involved in a variety of functions, such as self-consciousness, emotion, body representation, visual and motor imagery, and spiritual perception. This conclusion correlates well with subjects' descriptions of RSMEs as complex and multidimensional. Secondly, the researchers concluded from their research that when the nuns were recalling autobiographical memories of their mystical experiences, the brain activity was different from that of the actual mystical state, suggesting that the mystical state is different than an emotional state. This conclusion has reportedly been reached in previous research involving Zen meditation and Sahaja yoga meditation. Andrew Newberg published a second book in 2009 called How God Changes Your Brain. In this book, he summarizes conclusions based on over 15 years of ongoing research studying Sikhs, Sufis, yoga practitioners, and advanced meditators in an effort to map the neurochemical changes caused by spiritual and religious practices. He made the following conclusions. Each part of the brain constructs a different perception of God. Every human brain assembles its perceptions of God in uniquely different ways, thus giving God different qualities of meaning and value. Spiritual practices, even when stripped of religious beliefs, enhance the neural functioning of the brain in ways that improve physical and emotional health. Intense, long-term contemplation of God and other spiritual values appears to permanently change the structure of those parts of the brain that control our moods, give rise to our conscious notions of self, and shape our sensory perceptions of the world. And lastly, contemplative practices strengthen a specific neurological circuit that generates peacefulness, social awareness, and compassion for others. I'll let you read the book to expand upon that because we don't have the space here. Psychiatrist Dan Siegel, in his 2007 book, The Mindful Brain, describes the effects of mindfulness meditation on neural integration. Siegel describes mindfulness as waking up from a life on automatic and being sensitive to novelty in our everyday experiences. With mindful awareness, the flow of energy and information that is our mind enters our conscious attention, and we can both appreciate its contents and also come to regulate its flow in a new way. According to Siegel, direct experience in the present moment has been described as a part of Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Islamic, Jewish, and Taoist teachings. For example, many traditions teach some form of prayer that encourage the intentional process of connecting with a state of body or entity outside of the day-to-day way of being. Dan Siegel proposes in The Mindful Brain that mindful awareness promotes neural integration. In the same way that secure attachments and interpersonal attunement with significant caregivers allows for adequate development and functioning of the infant brain, including effective emotional regulation, balance of right and left brain functioning, and a holistic integration of brain functioning. So Siegel proposes that mindful awareness serves this purpose of promoting neural integration through a form of intrapersonal attunement. In other words, we are attuning to ourselves and creating neural integration by becoming more present and aware of our present moment experiences. According to Siegel, benefits of mindfulness include improved capacity to regulate emotion, improved patterns of thinking and reduced negative mindsets, enhanced bodily functioning such as immune response, stress reactivity, and general sense of physical well-being. Our relationships may improve thanks to improved perception of nonverbal emotional signals and enhanced capacity for compassion. There are also concepts of mindful learning that has been shown to make learning more effective, enjoyable, and stimulating. So Dan Siegel reports that sustained meditation leads to neuroplasticity, and we are aware that, in general, meditation results in changes in the regions of the brain dedicated to memory, empathy, stress, and sense of self, But what does that mean exactly? Here's a very quick snapshot of some of the research that's out there. Brain changes that have been associated with meditation from a variety of resources include increased axonal density and increased myelin around the axons, which you may recall is responsible for the speed of the firing of neurons. Research by University of Wisconsin neuroscientist Richard Davidson has shown that experienced meditators exhibit high levels of gamma wave activity and display an ability, continuing after the meditation session is ended, to not get stuck on a particular stimulus. That is, they're better able to control their thoughts and reactiveness. A 2005 study on American men and women who meditated 40 minutes a day showed that they had thicker cortical walls than non-meditators. This was interpreted by the researchers as meaning that their brains were aging at a slower rate. Cortical thickness is also associated with decision-making, attention, and memory. In 2008, Dr. Randy Zussman, a doctor at the Massachusetts General Hospital, asked patients suffering from high blood pressure to try a meditation-based relaxation program for 3 months. These were patients whose blood pressure had not been controlled with medication. After meditating regularly for 3 months, 40 of the 60 patients showed significant drops in blood pressure level and were able to reduce some of their medication. The reason, according to the authors, was that relaxation induced by meditation results in the formation of nitric oxide, which opens up your blood vessels. A 2008 study on HIV-positive patients found that after an 8-week meditation course, patients who meditated showed no decline in lymphocyte content compared with non-meditators who showed significant reduction in lymphocytes. Lymphocytes, or white blood cells, are the brain of the body's immune system and are particularly important for HIV-positive people. The study also found that lymphocyte levels actually went up with each meditation session. And finally, a study conducted by Wake Forest Baptist University found that meditation could reduce pain intensity by 40% and pain unpleasantness by 57%. This is significant, especially considering that morphine and other pain-relieving drugs typically show a pain reduction of 25%. This may have something to do with the fact that meditation works by reducing activity in the somatosensory cortex and increasing activity in other areas of the brain. So, I could spend hours looking at spirituality in the brain, but you and I both don't have time for that. Clinically speaking, whether you are an atheist or a fervent believer in a higher power, as psychologists and therapists, we must be willing to explore our clients' faith, or lack thereof, with them, and it is in our best interest to understand the importance of spirituality to many people, in whatever form that takes. Some of the clinical implications include the following. I personally believe that the therapeutic relationship in and of itself can be a transpersonal experience. Like BUGENTAL said about transcendence, sometimes involving moving beyond the I and the other, we as therapists have the opportunity to participate at a very intimate level in the neuroplasticity of the client's brains by way of interpersonal attunement. I believe some of these interactions transcend what we might commonly describe as therapist-client relationships and engage what may be most closely described as an experience of active unconditional love. Given the proven effects of meditation and prayer on the brain, encouraging our clients to discover a practice that fits for them in light of this knowledge can be profoundly healing. More and more modalities are incorporating mindfulness in their procedures, but outside of manualized treatments, we can be encouraging these types of practices for our clients. Allowing clients to talk about their spiritual experiences and being supportive and validating of their altered states of consciousness and helping them to make sense of and see the benefits of such experiences can be profoundly transformative for a client. Whether we want to define these experiences as spiritual or not is not as significant as the need to make sense of the experiences and helping the client to attach meaning to what has occurred. Often providing the space to discuss it can allow the client to move to the next stage of growth or self-discovery as a result of the experience, maybe even a transformative understanding. In addition, being able to engage your client around the reasons they may be using drugs to obtain altered states of consciousness, instead of replicating a stance of drugs are bad, will open a door of understanding and rapport with a client who may be struggling with addiction and relapse. And then also being aware that altered states of consciousness occurs even within the therapeutic session. With careful observation and checking in with the client, we can use these altered states of consciousness to enhance the therapeutic benefit. And so while we have neither explained away spirituality as a specific brain center, nor have we proven that God exists, I hope I have at least exposed you to another way of looking at one or more of these topics and encouraged future research. Thank you for listening, and thank you for participating in this class. I look forward to working with you again next semester.